What connection does Knull have to the Guardians of the Galaxy, and how is he related to the origins of KNOWHERE? In the Guardians of the Galaxy, the domain simply known as KNOWHERE was an iconic landmark for spacefaring travelers. Eons ago, this used to be the head of a fallen celestial, and over the years, it has decayed and eroded until it became just a husk of its former self. It was mined for the brain matter inside the celestial skull, and then it eventually became the home of the Collector's Museum. Even more recently though, KNOWHERE was pillaged by Thanos for the Reality Stone, and then repurposed as one of the Guardians of the Galaxy's main bases of operation. In the comics, however, the head has a rather bloody connection to Knull, the god of the symbiotes who just became very important for the MCU. And today, let's talk about the comic origin of KNOWHERE and how it connects to Knull. Right now, the exact name of the Celestial has not been officially confirmed, but we do know that he was among the first Celestials to enter the age of what is known as the 7th Cosmos, with the plan for reconstructing the universe as they saw fit. At this point in time, the 6th cosmos had died out, and existence had been eroded down into an infinite void of nothingness, marking the time for the Celestials to breathe new life into the universe itself. A new eon. As they did this, they created stars, nebulas, novas, and other sources of light that encroached on Knull's kingdom. And while we've talked about the basics of the story before, we haven't taken a deep dive into exactly how the war broke out. Contrary to popular belief, Knull and the Celestials were not immediately enemies, but they would eventually become rivals as their relationship degraded. Initially, the Celestials approached Knull and offered him a place in the new multiverse as the King in the Black, a role that would have had him seen balance the power of the Beyonders. In essence, the Celestials ensured that the Beyonders maintained the structure of the multiverse by using the light of concordance to keep the multiverse from dissipating outwards. Think of the light of concordance as a band to tie the multiverse together as one, but the Celestials also needed someone to maintain the multiverse internally as well. This is where the King in Black comes in. The role of the King in Black is to use the power of the living abyss to channel energy throughout the multiverse from the inside. Where the light of concordance is the series of bonds that ties the multiverse into a structure, the living abyss is like the blood that has to be circulated from the inside. The two of these powers together create a complex fabric of light and dark, good and evil, that are woven together in interesting shapes and patterns to create dynamic life in the multiverse. A universe without the light of concordance would have no hope or virtue, while a universe without the presence of the living abyss would never have famine, death, or despair. A healthy universe is forged from a combination of all of these factors. In moderation, both of these things are good because they counteract one another, but in large doses, either can be dangerous for the universe if it ever becomes oversaturated. Essentially, the Celestials offered Knull the chance to live in the multiverse and be one half of cosmic balance, but Knull refused. Knull did not want the responsibility of deciding how much darkness to release at any given moment, and he especially did not like the notion that he would be held back, so Knull went his separate way. By this point, there was virtually no life in the 7th cosmos yet, and so when Knull refused and turned on the Celestials, there had not yet been death. Knull took the living abyss and grabbed an unrefined sample, infuriated that his kingdom was soon to be destroyed, and he decapitated a Celestial in his rage, as the rest of the Celestials took immediate notice of his action and crime. For the crime of quite literally creating death itself, they would banish Knull into the endless void. But this did not stop Knull from continuing his crusade against the Celestials, not only for encroaching on his empire, but for now imprisoning him in something that he deemed self-defense. When he murdered the Celestial, he had not yet finalized the Necrosword. The Necrosword was still crude and jagged. It had not been perfected, but the head of the fallen Celestial offered Knull exactly what he needed to create. This became the first casualty of the 7th cosmos, and for the first time in this eon, the concept of death was introduced. Nobody had died before KNOWHERE, making this head the single oldest evidence of death that could possibly be found in anyone in this multiverse. Knull, however, was not content to simply let the head drift through space, and he was actually the first one to repurpose the head of the fallen Celestial, making it the base of his operations. The Collector, the Ixatar Mining Corporation, and even the Guardians were not the first to have this idea, and this is where Knull constructed his forge. The Celestials believed him to have been banished, but little did they know that he had begun using the lost head of their fallen comrade to grow more powerful. Knull siphoned the energy and power of the living abyss and used it as an ore to perfect his new weapons, including finally putting the finishing touches on the Necrosword, something that would become later known as the first symbiote. What's more interesting, however, is that he tempered the blade with the essence of this dead celestial. With the energy of the celestial still weakly circulating through the severed head, Knull was able to tie the life force of the celestial to the blade that he had forged, giving it a dark and an unsettling ability, one to capture the souls of those that it slayed. The body of the celestial, however, eventually passed into the realm beyond, but there was one lingering thread that tied it to the main multiverse, and that was the Necrosword. KNOWHERE's body attempted to fulfill its objective by creating a new world around itself in the realm beyond, but without its head, the process was broken. Some pieces of the body ran on autopilot, but without a brain directing the actions of the body, the reality was that they created a non-functional, disturbing world. And this would later become known as one of the most torturous afterlives in all of Marvel Comics. With no head to guide the construction, it turned out horrifically. This strange plane of pseudo-reality was turned into an afterlife exclusively for the victims of the Necrosword. And this is where the souls of the slain would go after Knull and other wielders of the Necrosword butchered their enemy. Anyone who Knull or Gore killed with their crusades with the Necrosword certainly wound up in this bizarre afterlife, here where they were forced to relive their darkest memories and experience their greatest pains for all eternity. All the Celestial understood was to subject these inhabitants to pain and suffering. Whoever died would have their minds probed for the darkest moments in their life, including the moment of their death, and they were forced to go through this over and over again without end. This connection, however, was a two-way street, because every time a new soul arrived in the realm between, the body of the fallen Celestial would strengthen the Necrosword even further, and by proxy, would make the wielder stronger as well. The head of KNOWHERE, however, never crossed into the realm between, and it kept drifting through the cosmos until it was eventually abandoned by Knull, who ventured into his next endeavor of creation. Eventually, Knull put his time and effort into creating an army of living weapons, which eventually became known as the symbiotes, and so he redirected his efforts into carving the Clintar a place in the universe to call their own. The symbiotes would grow and evolve, and KNOWHERE was eventually discovered by other galactic travelers and made into a hub for the galaxy to use. KNOWHERE would eventually become the headquarters of scientific discovery that different creative minds could use to study events that took place at the edge of the universe. Different scientists and explorers from all over the cosmos could come and see exactly what the rest of the universe had to offer, and in the MCU, this eventually became home to one of the most advanced museums in all of the galaxy. We know that the Collector has one of the most extensive collections in the universe, and KNOWHERE is the perfect library for such a cache of information. Even though it had been traded hands many times in the past, the fact still remains that KNOWHERE did have a first inhabitant, the very person who murdered him in the first place, Knull. Everyone that has used KNOWHERE as a base of operations has found themselves crossing paths with KNOWHERE and can trace their involvement all the way back to Knull at the dawn of the cosmos, because without Knull, not only would the Celestial still be alive, but the head would never have been made into this place of great expansion. Whoever discovered KNOWHERE after Knull saw that it had been made into a living quarters, and there was already infrastructure in place to adopt this as their new home. There was an entire forge, complete with tools and weapons that could immediately be put to work carving out the rest of the head. And without Knull, none of this would have ever been possible. In the MCU, it's unclear whether or not this will be the origin of KNOWHERE for one simple reason, that being the restricted access that Marvel has to Sony's roster of Spider-Man and Spider-Man related characters. We know that they are limited in which villains they can use, and more importantly, how they can use them if the project isn't specifically labeled as a Spider-Man project. This is all to say though, that we would not be surprised if Marvel takes a different angle with KNOWHERE's origins, but if KNOWHERE exists in the Sony universe as well, or if we look to the comics, we can confirm that Knull was the one to sever the head of KNOWHERE the Celestial, and Knull is the one behind it. This goes even further though, because this wasn't just the first casualty of the universe, it was the first casualty of all universes that comprised the 7th cosmos. So you can literally trace the invention of death back to this one moment with this one Celestial and the vengeful god of darkness. Now as the first death in the multiverse, KNOWHERE is a reminder of where this multiverse came from and how violence was introduced for the very first time. And that, my friends, is what killed KNOWHERE the Celestial. But for more Marvel lore and theories, Hulk smash that subscribe button and have a great day.